I felt God's love, like truly felt it. I mean, to the point where I was sobbing uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop. But it was almost, but in that moment when I felt that, it was also, I felt this weight was just lifted. And it was like he got my attention.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and on today's episode, I'm joined by my good friend Paul Salazar, who lost his mother at 16, watched his father become dependent on pain medication, and at the brink of losing his family and sanity due to his own alcoholism, found the strength to do whatever was necessary to live on one day at a time in his higher power. Hey, thank you for checking out another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and just a quick little bit of housekeeping. I want to make sure that we state, like we do at the beginning of every episode, that while we do encourage everybody that's on the show to share from their experiences in their recovery program, we want to make sure that we are at least honoring the spirit of the kind of principle and requirement of anonymity that most recovery programs have, even if we can't honor it, directly and literally being on a public platform, by stating that, whoever's on the show, myself included, we are not a representative of whatever recovery program we choose to share our experiences from. We are just sharing what has worked for us. We're sharing the steps and the process that allowed us to find recovery and find sobriety and hope. But we do not represent the recovery programs that we belong to. So, with that said, I've really been looking forward to introducing you to today's guest, which is Paul Salazar, who is a good friend of mine, and he was really in my corner way before I got sober, but somebody that was always there to encourage me and always kind of kept the hope of sobriety alive in my mind before I was ready to engage in it. So he is joining us remotely today from Oklahoma City. And Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your recovery?
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be on here, and I appreciate you saying those things about me. I think most of those are true. At least I'll pretend that those are true. But but anyways, my name is Paul Salazar. Yeah, and I'm in recovery for alcoholism, and grateful to be alive and sober and everything else that comes along with the lifestyle.
Yeah. So your main drug of choice, I should say, in lack of a better term, is alcohol, correct? You said
it was, alcohol. I dabbled in some recreational drugs, but nothing to quite the extent that alcohol did. That was my main drug of choice for sure.
Yeah, we've all got our favorite. So man, I just a little backstory on Paul. Paul, you were pretty new to CR when you started coming around the village, right? The church that we ended up both attending.
Correct. Yeah. I started in the AA rooms, and I struggled for the first at least 2 years of my walk in sobriety. Whether it was, and for a number of reasons. First of all, I just wasn't ready to do it for myself. I'm just, I'm that cliche that, that we all know. And I was that person that I was doing it for my wife. I was doing it for my kids. I was doing it for everybody but myself. And so, I got my feet wet in AA. And I bounced around from sponsor to sponsor, and that was just because honestly, I just wasn't ready to hear the work that was going to take to make it happen. And I finally one day, after like I said, years of struggling, I finally found a guy that walked in, and just so happened he walked in with a Black Sabbath t-shirt on, long hair, and it was like that ray of sunshine just walked in as like. I think this guy has something I might be interested in, and it turns out he was the right guy. But all that being said, I knew as much as AA was important, as much as AA was necessary for me to get sober, I knew there was something missing from my life.
Mm.
And I moved from Texas to Cincinnati, and I had a great home group there in Texas, and I had a therapist that I was seeing regularly. I was going to at least 2 meetings a day, meeting with my sponsor almost daily. And so fast forward moving to Cincinnati, I mean, I was a fish out of water for sure.
Mm.
And I was having a hard time finding consistent AA groups that were around the area that I lived. And so I just happened one weekend, I happened to go back to Texas. I had to do to finish up or tie up some loose ends, and went down there and met with my therapist. And in that conversation, he was like, "Hey, have you ever heard or thought about Celebrate Recovery?" And at that point I was like, "No, I don't even know what you're talking about." He was like, "Hey," he's like, "it's a Christ-centered recovery group." He's like, he's like, they're really great. He's like, it's like, I've heard good things about them, blah, blah, blah. And so, so anyway, so I was like, okay, well, cool. I'll check it out. And it just so happened that the church we had just started calling our home there in Cincinnati had a CR or Celebrate Recovery that they had at one of their churches or one of their church plants. And so, as soon as I got back, I looked around. I was like, of course, like anything, I was hesitant because I knew what worked, and I was, you don't want to change what works.
Right.
And so, but it was just, I kind of started putting those two together. Like, okay, well, it's coming from the church that we just joined. It was, it was all these things were falling into place. And so anyways, long story short, ended up going down to a little place in South Lebanon called the Village Community Church. And lo and behold, I walked into those doors, and, God met me right at that door. I didn't know I needed it, but, like everything else, that I've come to understand is that he knew exactly what I needed, and he knew where to lead me.
Right. Yeah. Before we get too far into that, let's take a step back. Let's start back, because I know you've got things. Because I think it's important to kind of set the stage for what led up to the struggles that you had that led you to finding recovery. So let's start back as far as you want to go, and kind of give us the Paul Salazar origin story, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, so I come from a long line of alcoholics on both sides of my family. My mom's side, grandfathers, uncles. I'm sure her father. I didn't meet him. I didn't know him very well, but I which obviously was my grandfather. But I know there were some abuse problems there, substance abuse problems there. Same thing on my dad's side, including my father. That's my background as far as coming from that lineage. And honestly, just being surrounded by it pretty much from the time I could walk to, my whole entire childhood. Like, I don't remember a lot of weekends not spent either with family, friends, and or at dances. And both my mom and my dad, mostly more so my dad, but certainly my mom as well too. He was always drinking. There was always alcohol. There was always beer in our refrigerator. There was always a dance or a party to go to, or a poker game that he was playing in, and which was always usually at either a friend's house or a family member's house. And so, of course, I was the beer getter. Mm. And so, I would be that kid that would take little sips off of beer cans while I was delivering
little delivery fee,
little delivery fee. Exactly. And, the funny thing is, like, never once did I ever take a sip of beer. And I know most kids' reactions, at least in my head, the way I have it, set out, is when kids usually drink something like that, their first is to pucker and go, "Wow, it was gross."
Right.
I can recall, I don't ever recall ever having that repulsion.
you were in the AP course to alcoholism right off the bat. Honor student.
Yeah, there was absolutely, like, there was never a time that I went, this is pretty good. Like, I was okay with it. Like, I didn't mind. I liked the burn. I don't think I ever took enough sips to where like obviously I was, I got a little buzz, but I certainly, but again, who knows? I could have, and that's probably why I was I was more than happy to go get beers for,
Right.
for 12 guys playing poker. Um, so yeah, so that being said, so that's kind of that's the background part. But beyond that, when you my parents were young when they got married, both came from broken families as well too. Like I said, my dad's one of 12. My mom, and they were, I mean, he was born dirt poor. My mom was one of two, but her family, that my grandmother and her real father, I mean, it was a time where they got divorced, and in a time where it was really, really like it was a big scandal to get divorced. And so she grew up around that. She went and lived with my great grandmother, her grandmother, and there was a lot going on both sides of the family. So that being said, they met each other, had my brother, and um, and then had me, 5 years later on, and it, from what I can tell and from what I've been told, even like through friends, it was always a very tense relationship. They were always fighting. They were always arguing. My dad didn't have very much of an education. My mom was very gregarious, very outgoing, very. She was just the life of the party. And so I think a lot of what kind of would transpire after a lot of drinking would be my dad. I mean, there was usually 9 out of 10 times when they would go out or we would go out, we would come home I mean, it would start in the car. I mean, just flat out screaming and yelling at each other. And then my dad, we'd get home and there would be plates, glasses, windows broken, doors slammed, getting in the car, screeching off at 4 or 5 in the morning. I mean, that was a normal Friday or Saturday night. And it wasn't, and the next morning, my dad would, of course, would be hungover. My mom would wake up. Sometimes we would actually leave. My great grandmother lived right down the street from us. So sometimes we would leave in the midst of those arguments, and we would just go to, go and fall asleep at my grandma's house, at 4 in the morning. Or there were times where my dad, it was a Monday or Tuesday night, and 2 in the morning, my mom was waking me up to go look for my dad in the bars out in the streets on the school night. So there was obviously there was a lot of chaos, a lot of arguing in the house. And, the funny thing is I look back on that and I still count myself blessed because I had so many friends that I grew up that grew up in my neighborhood that didn't even have fathers or had fathers that were in and out of the house, but they really weren't present. My dad, I will give him this. He was present for as much as he could be, but it was just always really, you just never knew which dad was going to come home, walk through that door. And so, that's a lot to, I guess, to take on as a kid. And so, looking back, I had a ton of anxiety as a kid. I don't know if it was a direct correlation or result from kind of what I was seeing, but, I was always a nervous kid. I was always a very panicky kid. I was always that kid. I would literally stay in bed or lie in bed and just fixate on the fact that the world was going to end for no reason. That's like 8 years old,
Right. Yeah. I feel that. Cause I kind of struggled I didn't have as much anxiety, but I had a lot of depression. I mean, as early as I can remember, depression was a part of my life. And did you feel that way too? Where it's like, I don't remember a childhood memory. I don't remember a time in my childhood where anxiety wasn't a constant companion for me. It was always there. Yeah. The same way for me.
Not really. Man. Yeah. Not really.
Yeah.
And even go ahead.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah. And even in just everyday life, even going to school, I was bullied in school. And so even waking up for me and even the idea of having to get dressed and go to school, knowing that I could get beat up, that was always a threat. My neighborhood was not the safest, nicest neighborhood. It was a all Hispanic neighborhood. This was in the early 80s where a lot of gang activity was going on. And so there was a lot of environmental, uh, and just, chaos and just really dangerous things that we were surrounded by daily. And so I don't know if maybe that maybe attributed has, can be attributed to some of my anxiety, but I certainly never felt just like a normal kid. And that's something I probably should have started off with. Like, not once did I ever, even as a 5 or 6 year old, I just always felt like I never fit in somewhere.
Hmm. No, that seems to be a pretty common theme. And for those of you that listen to Dustin's episode, Dustin Vance and Mitch Spees, and it'll come up when I share mine. And now hearing it from Paul, like it seems to be a pretty common theme for those of us that find ourselves in recovery, that we tend to feel pretty isolated, tend to feel pretty alone. Like even part of it being our own kind of I don't know how to word this, like our own kind of self-inflicted isolation. Like we feel like if people knew how different I was, there's no way I'd ever be accepted. And, especially when you're a kid, things tend to find them, that situation, that feeling tends to find you whether you want it to or not. Like kids are pretty brutal. Like if you're different at all, they're going to see it and they're going to point it out and they're going to use it against you.
Yeah.
And so,
For sure.
So you've got the tension between your parents. Alcohol is a presence, kind of a little bit of partying, waking up at 4 a.m, 2 a.m to go try to find your dad at a bar, the staying. So you've got all of that. You've got the anxiety, that I'm sure looking back, you're like, well, of course I had some anxiety as a kid.
Yeah.
There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of
Sure.
chaos in my life. So you're there, you're kind of not fitting in. You've got the pressure and the dread you feel about going to school because of the bullying.
Yeah.
Did this go all the way through? Did was that just a part of your school life all the way through graduation? I mean, what's kind of walk me through that?
No, actually, it's so again, so to make matters worse, my family was somewhat intact. My family, they had done well for themselves, just as a family in the whole. So we never were in danger of ever like having our house like ever foreclosed on, or lights. Like I never had to worry about lights ever not being on in our house or food being in the refrigerator. And unfortunately, that was I had a lot of people that I grew up with that were always moving for whatever reason or another. And looking back now, I realize because they were either being evicted or they were they just couldn't afford where they were going or where they were staying, and blah blah blah. Didn't help that I was also a very light-skinned Hispanic in a predominantly, and in my culture, that's not a good thing, because it put a target on my back, puts a target on anybody's back. And whenever you're not the stereotypical, or you're not the prototypical, this is what you should look like. This is what you should sound like. This is what you should dress like. These are the things that you should do. There's all those typecasts and stereotypes are there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And there I was sticking out like a sore thumb. Like we had nice clothes. We had a nice house, and I say that with whether they, you can't see these quotes and these air quotes I'm putting out there, but we had nice things for the environment that we were in.
Right.
But didn't mean though we didn't, I can't tell you how many times, I can't tell you how many friends or people that I knew in my childhood aren't even alive to this day because they got caught up in all that gang stuff, and either they were shot, they were killed. I mean, it was just, that was the reality. That was, so there again, that bred a lot of jealousy. And so just being that kid, it was, I always had that target on my back, and who am I going to turn to? Because everybody else in the neighborhood looks different than me. Nobody understands. So it's not like I didn't have any allies, and I get it. I understand it, but it's, like I said, and like you pointed out, it's a really lonely world to live that way. Mm-hmm. And just in that constant fear of, okay, and it was, and I want to say, I would love to say it was just once in a while, but it was all the time. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like when my mom and dad, like them arguing, it wasn't just here and there. It was, I mean, there wasn't a week that, there were very few days or weeks that went by that things weren't just, I mean, whether there was a physical fight, whether it was a shouting match, whether it was, cursing at each other or throwing each other out. Like there was always something to look forward to. But and so as long as I stayed in my neighborhood and in the schools that I went to that were kind of connected to my neighborhood, I had those issues with the bullying and just kind of that fear of, okay, what's coming next.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until my sophomore, junior year that I switched schools and I went to a school outside of my district, and it was in a predominantly white part of the city, that I finally was able to kind of get away from all that. Because I obviously the history wasn't there. I also looked more like them than I looked like, from where I was from. And so that helped a lot. But, and looking back as well, too, and I forgot to mention, I'm 100% positive that I struggle with ADHD. And I know my parents, it was brought up to them several times to go and get me tested and get me medicated. And I think, I don't know whether it was just from just not really kind of burying your head in the sand and just really not trying to look at what the problem is. So then I was never diagnosed, but man, I was in trouble all the time at school. I can't tell you. I mean, I was probably kicked out of 6 schools before I was even in middle school.
Holy cow.
Due to my behavior. And again, you would think at some point they would go, well, maybe there's something going on. Can't all be him.
Things were different back then. I mean, I'm younger than you, and even growing, let's see. So in the mid 90s is when I was kind of going through elementary school, when, typically today, that's when you start to see the problems, like any kind of behavioral issues in school. That's typically when things start to get addressed. Hey, we should look into this. Even in the mid 90s, things were just kind of starting to to change, where it wasn't just, that's just a bad kid, to, hey, maybe we need to talk about, there being ADHD or something, something like that. I mean, it's completely different. I know that, you having kids now, I know that it's my kids are still kind of too young for us to really have experienced anything yet. As far as even being exposed to it, but I know that you've got some kids that have been through school now, so it's I know that you've seen the difference, and man, you were kind of just labeled and stuck in a corner, and we're just gonna mitigate as much as the damage they can cause, but we're not going to give them any kind of actual attention or help. Really, we're just going to kind of get them, either kick them out or get them through, one way or the other.
Oh no, 100%. Either I was kicked out because they were just tired of it, and God bless their souls, because I know for a fact. I mean, if I was on, let's just say, if I was on, a level 7, I knew how to take it to a 10 to make sure that I got their attention.
Right.
I knew I possessed that skill really early on, and so, I didn't give them a lot of choice, and whether or not, and then if I didn't get kicked out, then I got passed on, because they didn't want it. They were tired of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? That was kind of, I'm, you were talking about in the 90s, you were in elementary school. I mean, this was 81, 82, and I'm in, first grade. And so, I know we've come a long way from there, but I do remember the conversations that were being, at least I think I remember, but I'm pretty sure, I know that was something that had been brought up to them, so on more than one occasion, that, hey, you might want to get them checked out, and just for whatever reason, like I said, I know they had their own stuff going on, and it's a part of the story. I wish things could have been different, but they just weren't. It's certainly, I'm sure it taught me things on just how to survive and how to kind of be able to work a situation to however I needed it. But I also knew, like I said, I knew that I possessed that power to be able to just blow crap up whenever I wanted to. Mm-hmm. I knew it, and it was something that I really was like, okay, cool. Ignore me, watch it. And a lot of that had to come from, that came from home, because I think they were so involved in their own lives. My dad, his work kept him out a lot. And then when he wasn't working, obviously his selfishness kept him out a lot, even longer.
Right.
My mom was always throwing herself into like social activism and stuff like that. And so, I have an older brother that was a phenomenal guitar player. I'm sorry, golf player as a kid, and like showed a lot of promise. And so I know that they put a lot of hope and effort and money and resources into, cultivating that, and to really, really making sure that he had every opportunity to excel. And I was always the forgotten kid. I would get dumped off at whoever would take me. And most of the time it was my great grandmother, who lived literally a block away from us. But I always had that feeling, though, that I was in the way,
Mm.
And it really was. I mean, there were times where, like, I mean, I would get taken to places that no kid should be taken to, and not in a bad way, but just like there were no other kids around. It was
Right.
all adult type of situations. And there I was, a 7-year-old kid in the middle of nowhere, Texas, hanging out while adults drank. And this is way before Nintendos and Switches. And
Right. Right.
so, I mean, there's nothing to do. And so, I spent a lot of time in my head. I spent a lot of time, in just daydreaming, and just, again, I don't, there was a lot of loneliness there,
Sure.
but but in a really weird way. And I'm not really sure, maybe this is just something that, but I was never unhappy. You know what I'm saying? Like there was never a true, like, sadness. It was just more like, well, this is just the way it is. Accept it.
Right. Right.
And so yeah.
So to go back to when you changed schools, what was that high school? Was that junior high?
That was high school. So
High school.
Again, I found myself in some big trouble at my first high school that I went to the point where I literally had to go in front of the school board to even get back into a school in the district. It was, my reputation definitely had preceded me, and so that was just one of many strikes on my record that I'd already had acquired at that point. And so, but by that point too, and I failed to mention, when I was 10 years old, that to me, that was like that was a year, my 10-year age. That was a year that everything for me just kind of, everything that was safe, and again, I'm using those air quotes that you can't see,
Mm-hmm.
kind of fell apart. In February of that year, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 36 at the time. And this was back then. I mean, breast cancer was, I mean, I know it was around, but it was just kind of one of those deals where it didn't have the spotlight that it has now. There was no Susan G. Komen. There was no, let's wear pink. There was none of that. It was just kind of like, well, here it is. We're going to treat it, do this and do this, and, you'll be okay. Little did, and that was probably the worst thing from that situation, was there wasn't any more treatment besides whatever was prescribed from the get-go. So that was in February, and that kind of happened. And there was obviously a lot of fear, a lot of just kind of like, oh, well, what now? And then in October of later on that year, my dad was at a job site. He was up on a five steps on a ladder and fell on his back. And, he was able to get himself to the hospital, but he said he knew that he was really hurt because he could barely walk. Long story short, like, he crushed 5 discs in his back. And again, if we had the technology that we have today, he's probably in and out within a day. He's probably walking within a week, and he's back to work within a month. But back then, it was catastrophic, because number one, I mean, he was making great money. We went from having that to, not having his income.
Right.
And then from that point on, we were in and out of hospitals, whether it's for my mom, from cancer, we'd go into remission and would come back. with my dad, it was, well, hey, we have to do another surgery. So by the time I was like 13, my dad had already gone through like 5 back surgeries. My mom was constantly in and out of remission. And so it was just a lot of turmoil, but it was a different type of turmoil. So, and I like to say that the argument at that point had stopped, but it was just a different type of argument. It wasn't every weekend the way it used to be, but it was still present.
Right.
There were some concessions being made, but it wasn't like, it still wasn't, the prototypical, happy household, so to speak.
I'm sure that's got to further drive in that isolation, right? Like if
Yeah.
you felt like you weren't getting attention before when both your parents were healthy, I mean, I know that thankfully, by the grace of God, I've not had a lot of medical things to deal with, but in the few that I've had, man, like when your health is in jeopardy, even if it's something like with your dad where it's your life isn't in danger, but your livelihood or your just your general well-being is being affected, man, that takes a lot of your attention span out. Like you can't operate from a deficit of self like that without a lot of support. And so I'm sure for you as a kid, it just further drived in that isolation, that lack of attention.
Absolutely, it did, and it also it took him from this person of like, you always look at your parent as like, they're superheroes,
right,
and all of a sudden that superheroes has now become like,
you're mortal like the rest of us.
He's mortal, yeah. And so that figure is just it's rearranged, and so the same thing, it was the same thing with my mom. Like she was the life of the party, like she was this person, like she was full of life, like she was like, I mean, to this day, I've never seen anybody walk into a room and just be able to command it the way she did. She was able to. And so her and I were super close because, I look like my dad, my brother looks like my mom, but, but I was close to my mom. My brother was closer to my dad. And that's just kind of what it was. So when all this, this is all happening, and like I said, I was 10 years old. It started at 10. And it was just a roller coaster from that point on. I mean, in and out of hospitals. Sometimes my dad would be in a hospital for a month after back surgery. Sometimes my mom, like I said, with her condition, like it would be gone for 6 months. When we were, on a lucky year, which I think we had maybe one of those, it was like a year and a half. It was in remission, and they came back. And then, there was always just different types of treatment. So all this is going on. I'm getting kicked out of schools left and right. I'm still dealing with, I'm still dealing with all the pressures from the neighborhood and going to school in the neighborhoods. But who am I, but I didn't have, who am I going to talk to about this? My parents had so much on their plates. I mean, there were literally more so for my mom than my dad, but there were times that, it was life and death. And I'm not going to bring my small little, hey, so-and-so wants to beat me up, or I don't want to go to school, or, because, why? I mean, I'm complaining to, look at who I'm complaining to. I mean, they had real problems, and my problems were, okay, well, get your butt kicked and let it be over with. So going, like I said, so getting past that, my mom ended up, she lost her battle when I was 16. And so it was right after I had gotten kicked out of that first high school and switched over to the last high school that I finally found people that I could, I just felt a little bit more kinship with, for lack of a better term. But yeah, so at 16, I mean, any hopes, any sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. It would just, I guess all the breath was just pulled out of me.
Well, I'm sure at that point in your life, 16 is a kind of a rough, it can be a very rough time for anybody.
Yeah.
No matter what your situation. Just things are changing. You're in a transition part of your life. You're not a kid anymore, but you're still a kid, but you're not a little kid, and you're not an adult, but you've got this, precipice of like, we're about to kick you off the ledge into the real world. And on top of that, your mom passes away. So I imagine that I imagine that there's a certain lack of concern for your future. Like you're like, I don't even, I'm still, I'm sure you're reeling from the loss of your mother, your dad's, probably, dealing with it,
He's
he's
doing, yeah, yeah.
absent, on top
Oh
of the
yeah,
health things he has, just switched
yeah,
to a new school. I'm sure you're
yeah.
just kind of in some ways, kind of just in a survival mode. Like I'm just trying to get by. I'm just trying to figure out today.
In a lot of ways, I was. I mean, it was just. I mean, having 6 years of ups and downs, of uncertainty, of peaks, mountaintops, and valleys, and I'm literally, I watch this beautiful person, her life being literally
Mm,
stripped away from her, and this is all happening in right down the hallway for me, and this is, she goes from being this outgoing, smart, intelligent, beautiful woman to, I mean, the last few months, I mean, she had a stroke. I mean, she couldn't talk. I mean, it was just, I
mm,
mean, talk about just seeing life being taken away. That was those 6 years. 10 to 16 was those 6 years. My dad in that time is taking care of her. And, looking back, I can see why God, why the plan was for him to get hurt the way it was. Because had he not been home, he would, I don't know if he would have handled it or been able to do what he did for her for those last years of her life. Because he was literally, I mean, he was her caregiver.
mm.
I mean, he woke her up. I mean, he made her sure she had her medications. He made sure, she was bathed and this and that. But it all came at a cost, though. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Like, it took him to get, his health to be, to be just destroyed.
Mm,
You know, and in the process of that, he's also become a dependent on Darvocets and hydrocodone, and
mm-hmm.
because his pain management is, he's in so much pain, she's in so much pain, and it's just, and I'm surrounded by that, and so a lot of the household um, responsibilities came on me. I was writing checks when I was 15, 16 to pay the mortgage, to pay light, to pay insurance, to pay credit cards, to do, you know, I was doing it. I was going to the grocery store. I was filling in where two parents should be filling in.
Mm,
But I also understood too. I understood that they had so much on their plate.
sure.
Like,
Sure.
it's not, and again, there wasn't much thought. I wish I could say there was this grand, I had this grand plan of, I'm going to come in there and I'm just going to, put my head down and kick ass and do this and that. I was so naive to the whole entire thing. That's all I knew how to do,
Mm-hmm.
is just, survival. It's just what you do.
Yeah.
It's instinctual. You don't think about it, because in those moments, if you think about it, you're dead.
Right.
Because that's where I was at that point. 16, mom died. Dad is a full blown pill junkie, depressed. I'm in a new school that is in a very wealthy part of town, with kids that are driving Corvettes and Mercedes and BMWs. And I came from a high school where, you know, if you had a car, man, you were rich.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, it was, and oh man, you can afford lunch. Like, to, fast forward going to this new school. I'm going, with some of the people that I met. I'm going to country clubs and having lunch with these kids. So just talk about just a complete 180. Just, I mean, it was just, there was so much coming at me,
Mm,
and I felt so. Talk about a lack of control,
mm.
and I'm spinning, but I don't know how to get off this ride. And the weird thing is Matt, I don't know if I really wanted to get off at that point,
Well,
because
it's
I didn't know how to operate. How do you operate in any other way? All I knew is this is how I knew. This is how
right.
I didn't know there was a different way of life.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say, is that it's familiar once you've and I relate so much to what you're saying about being in survival mode, that it's like you there's to be in survival mode is such a natural thing because it's kind of just built into us. right?
Sure.
Like, and
Yeah.
some people have, I mean, in my experience, some people have and some people don't. Like, but if you're the kind of person that you kind of have that strong survival instinct, and you don't have, there's like a certain point of like, I don't have to think about this. I don't like my circumstance, but like once you get locked into that mode, you don't have to think about how you're going to live your life. Like you know
Yeah.
how you're going to live your life. And
Yeah.
so to get out of that is a learning process. I mean,
Sure.
most of us who grew up in that kind of being in survival mode, like we have a hard time. Like a big part of us, in recovery terms, living life on life's terms. A lot of that is like, oh, I don't have to live like I'm in survival. Like you have to retrain yourself as a human being how to interact with other people, and how
Absolutely.
how to treat your life. And so I totally get where you're coming from that. Like it's as crappy as it is, as bad as your situation is, you are getting by.
Sure.
So I
Sure.
completely understand what you're saying. There's one thing I wanted to ask you, because just for the sake of how it might play, a role later in your story, is where was, like, was faith or church or anything like that a part of your life growing up, like,
Uh,
at this, specifically at this point when you're 16, the whole high school years, was did you guys, were you exposed to that? Was it ever important to you, or were you just kind of swearing it off? Where were you at with that?
no, yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that's really important. So coming from a Mexican, family, I mean, my mom's first generation from Mexico, or born, that's up here.
Hmm.
And I have family down in Mexico City. I have roots, deep roots. I mean, to the point where all throughout my childhood, like I was in Mexico for weeks on end. Like that was what it is. But what comes with that is the beautiful, the, the beautiful gift of Catholicism. And so as a young kid, like, I mean, we were drug to church every Sunday for whatever, yes. So the short story, or the short answer is yes. Religion, God, the church has always been a huge part. I have clergy, like, in our family, that runs in our family. We had nuns in the nunnery. So it always played a huge part. My great grandmother would host the priest that from our church that was right down the street, and for Christmas Eve and Thanksgiving. So we were always around. I was an altar boy. I was baptized in the Catholic faith. I went to a Catholic school. But it was always, for me though, it was always an interesting relationship, because going back to, the issues that I had with my behavior, like, it was pressed into me that if I didn't act a certain way, if I wasn't doing the things God had asked me to do or wanted for me to do, I would be punished.
Hmm.
So when I would get in trouble, the first thing that would come out of, and it wasn't, I know she wasn't doing it on purpose, or nobody did it on purpose, but the first thing was, well, you're getting punished because you're not doing what God wants you to do,
Right.
whatever that meant.
I'm sure
So
it
he
was
was,
well intended, maybe looking back, but did some
yeah,
damage.
but it did damage, because I was always afraid of, I didn't know, I didn't grow up knowing that God was loving. I knew a
Hmm.
God that would strike down if you were not, if you were not what he needed you to be.
Hmm.
Fearful. Well, the reason why this is happening is because I look at what I'm doing. Oh, I cursed, or I did this, or I'm not honoring my mother and father, or I've done this, or I've stolen, or I've cheated, or I blah blah blah. That was always something that was just absolutely beat into my head as a kid, as a young man. Like, the consequences of what's going on in your life are because of your faith, or lack of,
Mm.
or what you're doing right or wrong. So, you know, and I remember, like, I mean, we went and saw all kinds of, doctors when my mom was, getting sicker and sicker. We went and did all the things that, the Hispanic culture, like, we went to all the monasteries that have, the sand that replenishes itself and nobody knows how, it's
Mm.
blessed. We went to the place where the Virgin Mary had appeared, and, gotten the holy water from there. Like, we did all those things, like, to a point, like, well, this will work. Well, this is going to work. Well, and then finally, when it didn't happen, and all that prayer, all that time that I spent
Mm-hmm.
asking for God, please, please, please. And it happened. Well, maybe there is something, because I certainly was, I've been a shitty kid. In my head, I'd been a terrible kid. I'd been this, I'd been that. I hadn't lived the right way. At this point, by the time I'd already had sex. I've already, drank. I'd smoked a little bit of weed. Like I'd been the person that God didn't want me to be. So this had to be a direct result from, he didn't hear me because of my behavior.
So you took that and you internalized it and it turned into guilt.
My goodness. And but at that point, when that happened, that was the turning point with me and that relationship, where I said, I did it your way and it didn't work. I tried, I did everything that I felt that I could do. And it still got me where I was told if I pray hard enough, it wouldn't get me there. And it did. So from this point on, I'm on my own. It's been fun, it's been nice, but this is now my life to live. And I'm not looking back, and I'm certainly not going to make excuses, and I'm not going to sit there and apologize for anything from this point on. Because, at 16, I was hardened. My soul, my heart was hardened. I didn't, I everything that I knew to be safe was gone.
Right.
I knew how to bury my head in certain situations. I also knew by this point, and I now know this now, but I didn't know it at the time. I was building up these walls that I know at the time probably kept that survival intact. But as we all know, especially as we get further and further in recovery, as much as it protected me for those first whatever years of I guess of the results of everything, of all the chaos and everything that kind of came around, or that was involved in my life, you build it to protect you, and then at some point it jails you, it imprisons you.
Right. The fortress that you build around yourself to protect yourself ends up being your prison.
Yeah.
Not to wax too poetic, but essentially that's what it is.
It is. It served its purpose for where it needed, for whatever reason. But at some point it's going to suffocate you. And I didn't know that that's where, but I had friends by this. So this is all kind of going on. And my mom passes away. And at this point, my dad goes into this deep depression, taking 40, 50 pills a day. I'm basically left on my own. My brother, by this time, he's married. He's already living his own. So I have carte blanche in my house. And up until this point, like I had drink here and there. I was still, my group we were all basically nerds. Like we didn't go out and smoke, drugs or do drugs or cigarettes, or we didn't drink. Like we would go to movies, we'd hang out. And that was a really cool, like tight knit friends that I had.
Right.
But once I switched over to the other school, and my mom, and all that, she passed, and of course everything that was associated with that part of who I was, I shut that out too, because it was to me it was just a constant reminder of what I couldn't go back to.
Yeah.
And man, it was actually, that's one of my things that I really, I feel bad about, because I really did. I turned my back on them for no reason. And I don't think they ever understood why.
When you say them,
my old group of friends.
Okay.
I'm telling you, we did everything together, but when I switched over and I had enough, and that's when I said, this is how I'm going to live my life. I'm not going to make, like, I really did a 180 and just said, and I turned anything that had to do with my past, as far as like, I guess basically what it was running away from the memories.
Sure.
And that life, because it wasn't, to me, it's gone. It's over. I can't get it back. And I certainly don't want to have a reminder every day.
Sure.
So I can reinvent myself to who I want now. I don't have those, I don't have that baggage of being the kid from, the north side and sticking out like a sore thumb. Now people over here look like me. And at this point, my mom had, we just gotten some money from my mom's life insurance. I could keep up with some of those kids.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize how wealthy some of them were, but in my head, it was, oh, well, cool. You're going to go skiing. Oh, yeah, let's go skiing. I had the money to go do it, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But now, like I said, but I also had carte blanche. I could walk in and out of the house when I wanted. I had a car. I had money. And the most dangerous thing that I probably had coming out of that was a big chip on my shoulder.
Mm.
And it was the ego started, the puffing of the chest up, just to kind of have people, just to throw people off of the trail of, hey, I'm hurting.
Right.
But I can't let people know that, because that means I'm not a man.
Right.
I'm lost. I don't know what the hell's going on. I mean, I'm spinning, but I have all of this freedom now.
It's a dangerous combination for sure.
And I have a new group of friends that they can go do the things I want to do. They listen to rock music. They do drugs. If God knows where their parents were, but man, I mean, there wasn't a lot of weeks that we weren't drinking during the weekday, and weekends were like the same. I mean, so it's like, I finally felt for the first time, I found a group. Like, okay, this is cool. And, that was where, like I said, where I really dug into, okay, this is now life on my terms,
right? Not
on anybody else's terms. And I'm going to say what I want to say. I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care about the consequences, the repercussions. Because I've seen that you can care all you want, it's still not going to change anything.
Right. So you have this newfound freedom. You've got the means to kind of do what you want to do, but you're in this kind of emotional tailspin. You're trying to kind of distance yourself as much from that, but you can't, obviously.
No.
It follows you around. So I'm assuming this takes you through high school, you graduate.
Yep.
What happens?
Which a lot of people said I wasn't going to do. And to be fair, they had every right to probably think that, because
I'm sure at the time you're like, yeah, I showed you, but looking back, you're like, man, that was close.
Yeah, because if you looked at my track record, up to that point, every indicator would point to, yeah, I don't know about this one. This one might not get there, not get to the finish line. He'll get somewhere. It just won't be. He won't find that pot of gold. I'll tell you that.
Right. So you graduate, just despite how much you maybe should.
Despite me, I graduated.
Right.
Despite all of my efforts to not
right.
succeed at school, I did.
So you graduate, and then what's the next stretch of your life? Do you go to college?
Yeah. So right after right as my that senior year was finishing, I started having, and I'm pretty sure it was probably PTSD. Of course I have no way of 100% knowing, but I started having major panic attacks, and I think it was a natural reaction from everything that I emotionally had been going through. And it was really crazy. Just when everything kind of settled and things stopped, everything was just kind of the dust was starting to settle. Right. It was still puffing up here and there, but it was a lot less chaotic at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then these panic attacks just started happening. I mean, now I'm talking hardcore. Like, I feel like I'm on a different planet, and I'm sitting here in a room full of people. My best friend's looking at me, talking to me, and I can't even, I feel a million miles away from this person.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having these daily, weekly. I mean, it was just, I mean, they were constant,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know. Again, I couldn't talk to my dad because he was dealing with his own issues. I can't talk to friends because I don't want them to think I'm crazy,
Right.
you know. But that's honestly where I was. In my brain, I'm like, I'm losing it. Like I am about ready to go absolutely crazy, and I didn't know I had options. I didn't know what to do.
Well, I'm sure going back to that whole living in survival mode thing, and I'm gonna kind of not I'm blanking on the word I'm reaching for, but I'm gonna kind of maybe project a little bit, and you can correct me if
Sure.
I'm wrong. But when you're living in that survival mode, and you're not supposed to stay there really, and so for me, and like I said, if you let me know if this applies to you or if it relates at all. But for me, when things were going well, there was always this impending sense of when's that other shoe going to drop. Like
Oh yeah.
when's like the shit gonna hit the fan again? And like if you don't know how to turn that off, it like it's almost like the quieter it gets in your life, the more that like buzz,
The more
that
the more the
hum.
more it amplifies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, and so
Yeah.
for it's just, do you feel like that was maybe a little bit of what was going on? I mean,
Yeah, I think so. I think I was just at the point where I was emotionally just drained.
sure. Yeah.
I was still fighting because by this time too, I'd like to say that things were better, and maybe they were on one level. I didn't have to worry about whether or not my mom was going to wake up and be in pain
Right.
100% of the time. So yeah, so that felt good that she's out of her misery, she's out of but I still have a dad to contend with that is
Mhm.
still hiding from the world. I'm still having to police myself and trying to get through life myself as well. And I don't know why they started. I really, I try to look back and I try to come back to it, and I can't pinpoint why.
Mhm.
All I know is that they were just it was there, and it was something that I could not figure out. Like I was spinning hard
Mm.
and just trying to understand like what the heck is going on. So that's when I found. So so out of high school. So that this was going on. I stayed back. I went to junior college my first semester of college because I didn't want to leave my dad at that point because I kind of was worried.
Mhm.
So did that, and then finally I was like, at this point, I'm like, I got to get the heck I got to get out of here. Like there's just too much. There's too many reminders. There's too much going on. And I'm honestly like, I think at that point, like I was sad. I didn't know, but I was sad.
Mhm.
And so I got up and left. But by the time I went away to college, for me it was freedom, but it also came with a lot of guilt. And it came with, I mean, again, I was still processing. I was still grieving. I was still trying to figure out
Sure.
what had just happened like the past 6 years. Like what, or seven at that point. It was, 8 years. Like what just happened?
Right.
And,
Right.
but what I found along the way is so how I learned how to quiet that panic mode was I realized that I could drink about 3 or 4 beers and those panicky feelings would subside.
Mm.
So I'm like, okay, well, it's better than taking pills. For whatever reason, I don't know why I I put that in my head, but I'm like, well, but I'm not on some sort of medication that a doctor would prescribe me because I'm not that type of guy.
No, I mean,
I'll just drink. I'll drink beer like a man.
yeah,
'Cause that's what we do, right?
I feel like that's not an uncommon um, kind of perspective for people to take, especially as guys. I noticed
Yeah.
this with a couple of my friends. A big part of my story. I'm actually just a quick plug. I'm actually going to have Dr. Brett Dowdy on. Recording an episode with him next week, and he's going to be talking about depression. And I kind of want to touch on this subject of why is there kind of this man, so blanking today. I'm the worst podcast host ever. But like, why do we have this preconceived notion? At least some of us, as especially in my experience, I've noticed as men, of like we have this like preconceived notion that like, man, drugs are bad. Like we don't want to be on. You don't want to be taking anything for anxiety or depression. Like that stuff is poison. And I'm sure for you, it's got to be like seeing your parents on medication as they're suffering. Like it's not exactly a good representation of like a medicine that helps, right? Like especially with
Sure.
your dad and the pain medication, I'm sure
Sure.
there's like a negative connotation with that. Like you kind of associate your dad's medication or pain medication at this point. It sounds like it was becoming definitely dependency,
Oh yeah,
maybe abuse,
for sure.
and you're like, I don't want to be that. And so like
Honestly, I never even thought of it until you just brought it up. But that's probably a pretty good. I would, yeah. I mean, I could definitely see that for sure.
well, we can thank my faux doctorate. That's why I can't wait for Brett to come on. Like, let's get an actual doctor in here.
Yeah, right. I mean, we can speculate all we want, but until we actually really know the science, I mean,
Right.
yeah, I mean, again, I think a lot of it has to do with it is how you're raised, how you're looked at, how you look at it, whether or not it's a taboo subject or not.
Sure.
I think a lot of just societal norms. Like I think you don't talk about your mental health. You don't talk about how you feel. And especially if you're a guy, well, that makes you weak.
Right.
Or it
right.
makes you, you're not a man if you're wearing your heart on your sleeve, so to speak. You're supposed to internalize everything. You're supposed to make it, again, it goes back to the ego and it goes back to that pride. I can do this. I've done this before. I know how to survive.
Right.
This is just another thing that's getting thrown on my plate. But like I did, in my head, like I did before, I will overcome this somehow, some way. I will adapt and I will figure it out and we'll move along.
Right.
It's cool. So, like I said, even while I was away at college, like I was having these attacks, like to the point like where like I wouldn't go anywhere. Like if I went, I would literally leave my house from my hometown, get in the car and panic the whole entire time while I was out, get to my apartment in my college where I was at in college and not come out. And other than having to go to school, like I wouldn't venture out. Like I became agoraphobic? Agoraphobic? Yeah.
I'm already struggling with words today, man. That's too many syllables. Come on.
Where I anywhere that didn't feel familiar, like I would go into a high spin panic attack. Like sure. I couldn't be around people. It had to be the right person or right people. Mm-hmm. And only if I had a couple of beers in me would I ever feel comfortable.
Sure.
But then, here's the problem is that, what I was creating was it was a false sense of hope, or it was this false sense of, hey, everything's gonna be okay. Cause I'd wake up the next morning hungover as heck, just head pounding, everything, and guess what's back? Well, the panic attacks are back.
And probably
twofold. So I'm not really moving the needle. All I'm doing is just kind of just putting it on mute for a couple of hours so I could at least enjoy myself. Because at this point in my life, I'm like, it was miserable. And man, that lasted for say 18, probably until I was maybe 23, 24. I mean, it would get less and less. I would have really good months, and then I would have months where like I couldn't stop the panic from happening. And then it would kind of subside, and it would and throughout that whole entire time, it would just, depending on how much or what the severity of panic I was in, would determine how much I would drink. And I had my routines. I knew where I could go. I knew where I wouldn't go. Like there were, things that my friends, my group of friends would do. They would go on vacations. They would go here. They would go there. And I would make an excuse on why I couldn't go. It wasn't because I couldn't go. I didn't want to get out there and have those feelings. I didn't want to have that panic out there. I didn't want to be out there and all of a sudden flip out and let them see what was going on. So it was a really weird, really, really weird time in my life. And Um, and I don't think, I had girlfriends at that time. I'm struggling with this, and they were, and of course I can tell you that none of them ended well because I wasn't willing to talk to them about what was going on. They just knew I was either drunk or I was a jerk or didn't want to do anything with them or would only do things with them when I was drinking. You know what I'm saying? Like it was just so. A lot of people that I dated were great people. they just got involved with the wrong with just a really messed up dude.
Mm-hmm.
And that was I just wasn't capable of sharing anything that I had inside because at that point I was so afraid of losing more that I can't let you inside at this point. Like right. I can't let you in emotionally. I can't let you in. I'm dead spiritually. I'm absolutely spiritually bankrupt at this point. I'm emotionally, I'm running on 10%. Physically is where I feel like that's where I'm at. Like if you're into a physical relationship, cool. That's about all I'm capable of. But anybody that came into my life around that time period, I had a lot of amends to do because they certainly I pulled them into my orbit, and it was really nothing that they did it deserved. But there were a lot of casualties. A lot of friendships were made and were destroyed. A lot of women were taken for granted. Casual sex was. That was. A lot of cheating. A lot of just hedonistic lifestyle. Like I was that prototypical guy. Like like ego driven. 10-foot tall, bulletproof. Like I was living that life, but yet inside I was scared to death. And that, and that's the fight, right? That's the struggle. That's what I was trying to reconcile those two worlds, and I couldn't do it. So I found that drinking made those two worlds go to each other's corners, so to speak.
Right.
And they would stop fighting for however long and here's the crazy part. Now I had the control because now I can control this. Because if I drink this, I can be this person. If I drink this, well, this will go away, but I can be. So now all of a sudden I had this control that I felt for 7 years, 6 years or whatever that I didn't have.
Right.
So now I'm starting to see, now I'm starting to feel this control that I didn't possess. And I like it. I'm cool with it because now I like this feeling of being in control because if I like it, I'm there. If I don't, well, I ruin you, and then I take what I want and I get out of the relationship, whatever I need, and I'm out of there, and I haven't lost anything.
Yeah, it was I was talking with when I met with Mitch and we were kind of talking about his story is that kind of the problem with alcohol and any substance for that matter is that they're wild beasts. Like you can't control them, as much. So like, yeah, the wild beast that is alcohol helps you manage your anxiety and all of those things that you mentioned, right? Problem is you can't control alcohol. And I've never met anybody that's successfully done it. So, as far as using it to the extent that those of us in recovery have found ourselves using alcohol. And so I want to, if it's not too far of a jump, you were talking about your relationships, and if there's something in between here and there that you want to bring up, but getting to you met your wife, obviously. I know having the benefit of hearing your story already, I already know that the recovery comes after you meet your wife. And so is it okay if we kind of jump to that part, or if there's anything in between that you want to bring up, for sure, feel free to do it.
No. I think just to kind of really just to kind of put a little bow on that, like my 20s they were reckless. They were certainly, they were me at my most selfish. They were me at my furthest point away from God and faith, and all of my behavior and actions and everything about me at that point, looking back, like all points, like the writing was on the wall. I surrounded myself with enough people, with enough yes people, or people that would enable me. I got really smart about that. My manipulation was on point. Everything that as an addict that we know how to do, or are those seeds were planting, and those seeds were planted, and everything was, it was growing, it was flourishing. So, fast forward, so my 20s, in the process of all this as well too, I managed to graduate from college, of all things.
Man, you keep defying expectations.
I do, and I wear those things on my sleeve.
Yeah, that chip just gets a little bit bigger, doesn't it?
It sure does. I mean, and the chip is growing. The chip is huge now. I again, man, this is about me. This is not about what God has done. This is all about me. That's and right. My greatness. We all know how those stories end, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, I graduated from college, and for the first few years, I'm like, look, I don't know where I've been. All I know is, it's been a fun ride, and I certainly don't want to grow up. So I'm going to get in the, and throughout my whole entire college career, I'm in the restaurant business, and we all know, we've all heard the stories, and I can corroborate that the stories are true. It's a very interesting lifestyle. It's one of the greatest professions in the world, but man, there were so many traps and so many just things that you can really point towards and get lost in, and talk about just, so again, surrounding myself with with the right situations to make sure that I get what I need. That's all I care about. And then my 30s hit, and I'm working at a restaurant, and in walks this woman, and I don't know what it was. She walks in, and immediately, like, there was just this aha moment. I've never, up to that point in my life, I'd never had one. And I can still remember what she was wearing. I can still remember what I was wearing, where I was, what time of day it was. And I've never had that. And she walks in, and at the time, I'm in a relationship, sort of. Just a real quick story. If it tells you what I felt inside, my self-worth is, I was at this point, I was dating, and I thought I was in a serious relationship with a girl who had a sugar daddy that would come in town a couple of months out of the year. He lived over in Europe. He was very wealthy. She was a kept woman. She lived in a very nice high-rise building. I mean, she could do whatever she wanted.
Right.
And here I was dating this person, thinking that I had a shot. But that's just where, again, that's where my self-worth was at the time. That's what I felt like I deserved. It's what I felt it also, to some extent, it kept me safe, because I knew I didn't have to give this person my heart. You know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't have to let her in, because she's not letting me in, because she's not being honest. Why do I have to be honest?
Codependency.
Yeah. So, like anything, look, I mean, at the end of the day, I have an addictive behavior. Like, I can make a problem out of anything. Alcohol is, but I can easily swipe out alcohol for, relationships or whatever else I'm trying to fix. And, that's just weird. It's, what is it? It's just, that's just the way, I'm wired, and I had to learn how to accept that. But anyways, so in walks my wife, and at the time she's married, and, don't think anything of it. Like, we became instant friends, crazy good friends. She sees that I'm struggling, just monetarily in my life, and just, so she starts inviting me to lunches and dinners so I can eat. I'm still having this really cool lifestyle, but, like, I'm dependent on people. I'm using, right. I shouldn't even say I'm dependent on people. I'm using people for what they are. Like, I'm at this point, I'm a scumbag. Like, I really am. I'm one of those guys that I told myself I'd never be. Like, I'm a user. I'm an abuser. I'm taking everything for granted. I don't care about much. And then God walked this beautiful woman in my life. And, we became, like I said, fast friends, instant friends. And my relationship thankfully ended. Her relationship thankfully ended, and they didn't have anything to do with each other. They just happened to coincide. And so little by little, we became better friends. We still weren't romantic, but I think we both knew deep down inside there was something more about each other that we wanted to explore. We just didn't, I think both of us were kind of coming from that part of, she was broken in her own way, I'm broken in my own way. And so we really didn't want to, we were hesitant. But anyways, thought it'd be a good idea. So we started dating, and, I'm still in the restaurant business. I'm still, even while I'm dating her and I'm falling in love with her, I'm still a cheater. I'm still, messing around on her. I'm still trying to talk to the girl that I just left and blah, blah, blah. Or I'm starting to, or just sleep with anybody that walks through my restaurant door. And it's just, just where I'm at in life. So things get a little more serious, at least on her end. And I say that because I'm still living my life. Like, yeah, I have this, but I'm still over here looking for something else.
Mm-hmm.
And, and like I said, I certainly didn't deserve her. I probably still don't deserve her. But for whatever reason, she stuck around. And I finally got the ultimatum. She finally kind of one day, she was like, hey, look, she was real nice about it. She invited me out. I'm thinking this is going to be really cool. We're going to go have dinner, probably, get intimate, blah, blah, blah. And she lowers the boom, and she's like, hey, I was just thinking that I deserve better and more. And I don't want you to ever call me again.
Oh, damn.
Like, that's certainly not what I was expecting. Like, so, I'm like, so I guess there's going to be no sex. Okay.
Of course. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Like
in the place you're at in your life, I'm sure you look back when you say that, you're like, really, that's what I thought.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, so I guess this means I'm not gonna. So anyways, but the funny thing about that hammer that she hit me with was that was the first time that somebody had told me to not stay or to not call and to stay away, that I actually listened. And up until that time, man, if a girl had broken up with me, now if I broke up with a girl, it's cool. But if a girl had ever, like I said, I don't want to be with you anymore, man, I was that guy that would show up at their work and show up. I mean, I was crazy because it comes from that fear of abandonment that obviously I cultivated with my mom, and it was a problem when I was dating girls. Like any girl that wanted to break up with me, man, I made it really difficult for them to want to leave. They made the right decision, but I was just, and it was all operating out of that fear of abandonment.
Sure.
So I heard that from her, and I heard it loud and clear, and I was like, oh, okay. And I don't know why. I don't know what it was, but there was just like this, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I fast forward, I think 4 or 5 months later on, and we finally reconnected. We reached out, and I was like, hey, look, I'm miserable. And she's like, I am too. We, start, I try to go back to, I try to really honestly kind of clean myself up, but I'm at this point, I'm a full blown alcoholic at this point. I'm a highly functioning alcoholic. I have this amazing job. I'm meeting crazy, like influential, like I'm one of the restaurants that I'm working in. I'm meeting movie stars and rock stars and pop stars. I mean, I'm living this world of like, it's a complete, it's a crazy world. And here I am. I'm like, how the heck did I get here? But I'm miserable too, because sure. I can't do any of this. I can't function without it. I can't function without drinking. And I knew the reason why I had been waiting and I had been doing the kind of things that I, just to get serious with the girls, because I knew I was broken. I knew what I was holding inside. I knew what I didn't want to face. But against better judgment, and most girls, even close friends of mine told her, like, you literally are trying to tame the shrew. I mean, she's like, they literally told her that on the day of our wedding. They were like, you do realize you're you're taming the shrew. Like, this is like, what are you doing? Like, what? Like we love him, we do, but are you sure? And so we get married, and by this time we were pregnant with our first kid, our first daughter. And I should be on the mountaintop. I should be ecstatic and just over the hills, just screaming from the top of the from my lungs that, hey, a person loves me for all my brokenness, for whatever. She's gonna, she's gonna have a kid with me, and I should be, at my highest peak. And I was absolutely miserable. Mm-hmm. So instead of me, and I always told myself I'd have these life goals, milestones, that if I got here, I would stop drinking. If I got here, I'd stop drinking. If I did this, if I graduated from high school or from college, I would slow down. Once I got a real job, I would slow down. Once I got married, I would slow down. Once we had a kid, I would slow down. And unfortunately, I went the other way. Everything just started speeding up. And it was becoming more and more. Dependent on it, physically dependent. And I wish I could tell you, I knew where that moment where it stopped being fun and it became necessary, and it became a matter of life and death, but I don't. All I know is that I got there. And when I found myself there, I was, number one, I was in shock, and I was probably in shock for a while, because I just, how could it happen to me?
Right. You just wake up one day and you're like, I don't like this anymore. I don't like this, but I can't stop.
Yeah. It wasn't like I set out to do it because I could. Nobody wants to be an alcoholic. Nobody wants to be a drug addict. Nobody wants to, but here I am. And of all the things that I've been able to overcome, and that ego and that pride is now, it's chest bumping, it's doing all this stuff. And I find myself in this situation that I can't will myself towards. I can't will myself to do. This is an entirely different beast. I can't just stop and say, okay, it's going to be okay. Because once I do that, I am shaking. I am dry heaving. I am coming out of my skin. I'm panicking. I'm literally, I'm coming out of my mind. And so what I realize is that the marriage and becoming a father was exposing me for everything that I knew that I was and wasn't. And I think it was, those two worlds were they were gonna make themselves known whether I liked it or not.
Right.
And there was no way for me to get away from it. So, and I tried, man. I went to the doctor. I tried to get on some. I was like, hey, look, I'm a full blown alcoholic, but I don't think I need rehab. Okay. At this point, I'm waking up in the middle of the night. I'm drinking to go back to sleep. I'm drinking so I don't dry heave. I'm drinking to wake up in the morning so I don't throw up, and so I can actually stop shaking, so I can get in the shower to get dressed. I'm drinking on the way to work. I'm drinking at work. I'm drinking on the way home from work. I'm drinking while I pick up my daughter. I'm drinking while I take my daughter to daycare. And, I'm trying to, I look back and I cringe, but it's the truth. I'm still living, I'm still selfish. I'm still so stuck in my ways. But that's not the way marriage works. It's not the way fatherhood works. It's not the way life works. And how do but this is what I know. I built my, like we talked about earlier, I built those survival wall, those things that I was now at the point where not only was it suffocating me, but now it's taking on water. And it's at the top of my, it's to my eyes at this point. Like, I'm drowning in all ways. And I'm my work is it's suffering. My relationship is suffering. I'm certainly, I'm calling myself a dad, but I'm not a dad.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no dad gets behind a wheel and does that or at least a dad a good dad, a dad that cares about other people. They don't do that. Maybe they do. I don't know. But personally for me, it's just, that's where I was.
No, I mean, I think what you're describing is for those of you listening who maybe are not at the place where you're engaging your recovery or in a place to engage recovery seriously, or maybe you're in a place similar to where Paul is, or you're kind of at the point where you realize that things aren't quite meshing in your life between the choices that you're making with your whatever your struggle is that is pointing you towards recovery and what is going on in your life. This is not what Paul is describing is not living life on life's terms. Like there's a certain point that you only have so much capacity to do certain things in life without affecting other things. Yeah. And I know that what you're describing, I'm sitting here and it's hurting me. Like it's hurting my heart because I remember exactly what that feels like.
Sure.
And especially go ahead.
You don't want to be there. You just don't want to be there. Like you look,
right.
This is all in hindsight. And I wasn't trying to, me saying that wasn't trying to put anybody on blast. It's just, that's the way I feel now looking back. It's just, right. It's still, and like you said, it hurts me to even to this day to say that because I here I was, I this beautiful creature that I created, I had a hand in creating is, she's depending on me. She's, she doesn't know anything else other than to love,
Right.
And I should, for me personally, I should have taken that responsibility.
Sure.
A lot more to heart. But again, at that, where I was with myself and how I felt about myself and how I viewed things, I wasn't capable of, because I was so deep with in my disease. My disease had me by the throat, and it at that point it was telling me how to run my life. I wasn't in charge anymore. Like I had no control. I went from, this was a matter of life and death.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that wild beast thing that I was talking about that I mentioned from my conversation with Mitch, where it eventually owns you. You can't tame it. It's eventually going to be like the thing that you're trying to control is going to control you. And when I brought up the point, I definitely, if you're listening to this and you're at the place that I described where you're kind of at that, you're kind of riding that fence post. And I don't say that with any judgment. I say that to point, because I know Paul's story is that if you're at that place, take notice, because I want you to hear what's coming next, is the point I want to make. If you're at that place, just know we've all been there. All of us, every single person that's going to be on this podcast that's struggled with a substance or codependency or whatever their issue is, if they're coming on this podcast or they're in a recovery meeting and they've got any amount of time with sobriety and you look at them and you see change in their life, just know that they found themselves at this place. Yeah. And so the reason why I brought that up, and I want to make sure I'm clear, like it is not at all to make you feel bad at all.
No,
just know if you're at that place or you feel yourself starting, you feel that same thing that I felt, that tug at your chest. Just know, this is where we end up, because you can't, like what you're describing, Paul, is that tension between what is required of you in your life, being a father and being a husband and having a job and trying to be a functioning adult. Eventually those things come into friction. You can't have that dependency and live your life the same. One of those things has to give.
Exactly. And and it's important to really say too, and whoever is listening, and just know that you're not alone. And like Matt said, it's a part of the journey is to have those moments where you do look back or you're able to look back. Right now, I understand you're not able to because of whatever, but there will be a time where that it will all it'll reconcile itself. I mean, but it's just, you just have to. I knew early on, like I was so afraid of me that I was the only one, and going to those rooms, AA, Celebrate Recovery, and hearing people's stories sounded a lot like mine, and it became a lot less. I became a lot less fearful about what maybe the next step was going to be, because I was sitting here hearing these people that had a year or 2 or 6 months, and I didn't have that.
Right.
But I knew, but it gave me hope that if they can get 6 months or 6 days, well, heck, that's better than any day that, that's better than what I have right now, because I can't do it right now. So maybe I should listen. You know what I'm saying? Like there was something about that, and it will get better. It does get better.
For sure.
So anyway, so she does an intervention, and I go away to my first rehab for 4 months. I won't elaborate on that. All I will say is that if you are at a point where you are thinking about rehab, just make sure you vet what you're getting yourself into, because all rehabs, they're all needed for sure, but some just aren't. Some of them aren't. They aren't as advertised. And so if you're willing to do some research and just try to pick out one that works for you, without just kind of going blind. Any help is help, but sometimes it can put you further back than you maybe started the journey on. So I say that because I found myself in that situation where I went to one that I wasn't under my control. But God bless my wife. She was trying to do what she felt like she needed to do, because she was, at this point, she moved out of the apartment that we were living in, took the baby. I didn't know where they were for 2 weeks. And so needless to say, I was pretty much, I don't remember a lot of those 2 weeks, because I'll show you, being able to take it up to that level 10 where you think I drank before, let me show you how much I can drink now. Anyways, but the one positive thing I can say about my first stint in a rehab was I was able to not drink for 4 months, and that was 4 months that I hadn't experienced probably since my teens without drinking. And so that was an eye-opening experience. But I came back and I tried to assimilate myself back into my same patterns and my same habits, not necessarily the drinking part, but I went straight back into my friends. I went straight back into my friends group, and they were all supportive, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. I didn't know that I didn't understand the bigger scheme of things and how recovery works. So I came back just thinking, okay, well, cool. I have 4 months. It wasn't, and the reason why I say this about the first one is that it wasn't a 12-step based program. It certainly wasn't a Christ-based program. And so I came back even more proud and ego-centric that, hey, I just went through rehab and I came back and I came back to my job. I was making more money than before I left. Now I was sober. And so, man, what's going to kill me? Like, I'm awesome. I mean, nobody bounces back like this. And here I am living this fairy tale, and so I wasn't pressed into me. I wasn't told like, hey, you can't go back to drinking. I didn't know it was a disease. I didn't know what alcoholism was. All I knew is I had it. Yes, I knew I was an alcoholic, but I didn't realize the brain chemistry and the fact that, your brain is still drinking right along the side. I didn't know any of this. So I did, of course, try to go back and have a normal drinking life, a glass of wine here, a beer here. And it worked great for a few months. And, just like everything, all it needs is that one little sliver of daylight. And I was off back to the races.
One little nudge in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And, and at that point, but here's the important thing to know is that I wasn't surrounding myself with people like me. I put myself right back in the situations I had just gotten out of. I wasn't going to meetings. I didn't have a sponsor. I I I was I never told myself I wasn't going to drink again. I never took it seriously. All I knew was, okay, cool. I know I can stop because I stopped for 4 months. That's all I was.
Mm-hmm.
So I can go back to this as long as I'm careful and as long as I'm cool and as long as I do what I need to do. We can go back to a normal life. I can still do what I need to do. We're cool, but and that's just not the way it works. And so I found myself about a year later, right back where I stopped. But as we all know, it was even, I stopped where I left off, which wasn't in a good spot. It was a pretty scary spot to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I picked back up there. And at this point, I have a best friend that's about ready to pass away from cancer. My wife we are now pregnant with our second kid. And I'm about ready to get fired because my drinking now has become, it's now out in the open. Everybody knows what they're looking for now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm giving my wife every option or every opportunity to leave me. I mean, I'm every, the checklist of, yep, he's doing this. Yep, he's doing that. Leading a different life, just doing all these things. And because I still hadn't dealt with anything. All I did was go away and stop drinking. I didn't deal with anything at all. I was building clay models. What's that about? So anyway, I get up one morning and that she's gone, our daughter's gone. And again, I don't hear from them. She doesn't tell me what she's going to do. And my boss calls me and says, hey, he's like, I don't know what to do. He's like, but I'm going to probably be letting you go within the next 2 weeks. He's like, I want you to get better. I know you want to get better. I think you want to get better, but I don't have a choice. You're not giving me a choice. And I get this knock on the door and I get these, this divorce decree, these divorce papers. And here it is. But here's the line in the sand is, I get this, divorce summons from my wife. She filed for divorce. And here I am living in a big, beautiful house. Have a beautiful daughter, beautiful wife, a kid on the way, making the most money I'd ever made. And I was at the absolute bottom. And I should be the happiest guy in the world. And I'm at the bottom because I'm absolutely miserable. I'm guilt ridden. I'm ashamed of everything. I feel like I don't deserve anything. And that's where I was. And so I went, and one of the last things she said, she's like, if you put yourself in another rehab, it's got to be, you're going to have to do all the work. I'm not going to do any of the work for you. You have to do this on your own. This is now you're in this alone. I can't do this for you anymore. And, it's tough to hear, especially for somebody that you, from your wife. But she was absolutely right. So of course, it took me about a week or two to really kind of contemplate things. And I talked to my boss and he was like, hey, look, he's like, if you go and do what you do, you worry about you, don't worry about the job. I can protect this. I can do that. You get it done. And so I'm trying to figure it out. And I finally found a spot or a place that I looked at. I kind of made some phone calls and picked out a spot. And I went to my second rehab. And that's where everything changed, because for the first time I was doing it for myself. Yeah. And I can say that the divorce was hanging over my head.
Sure.
But there was no guarantees that had I gotten sober, she was still gonna stay with me. Like that was just something out there. Like it wasn't like, if you don't do this, I will go through with this. It was like, this is going to happen. And that's where, I went in there pretty much understanding that we were going to get divorced. There was no if you don't do this, this is, you're going to get divorced. And if you do this, I'm going to stay with you. So, but went in for 28 days, and it was a 12 step based program, and got out. And for the first time, I took it seriously. I was going to meetings. I did 90 and 90 at AA. I found, like I said, I found my Black Sabbath dude. Buddy's name is Mark, and honestly, looking back, I mean, he was a godsend. Like 100%. Had I not met him, and had he not been that guy for me, I don't know if I'm sober today, but thankfully I am. I also, and I need to mention, I also was, I reluctantly I started taking naltrexone, which is Vivitrol. Mm-hmm. And if any of you don't know about it, it's an anti-craving pill or shot that you can get, that you can qualify for. And I didn't want to take it at first. I was really, really hesitant. Again, I didn't want to be on something that a doctor prescribed, because that's,
right.
But after talking to the counselor there at the rehab center, and talking to my actual counselor, and talking it over with my wife, this was all, at this point, I'm trying to do the next right thing. I'm leaning into it, and I'm just trying to figure out how I can make this successful, not for my wife, not for my kids, not for my job, but for myself. Because I was tired. At that point, I was tired. Before I moved in that little moment of time where she was gone and I was in this house, like I literally, it's the first time I probably dropped to my knees, and I was asking God for help. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't do this, but I don't know how to do this, but I don't want to do what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Like, I just run out. I'd gotten sick and tired. I was a cliche. I'd gotten sick and tired.
Being sick and tired.
Mm-hmm. And it's a cliche for a reason, but it's the truth. All these things, all these little, these little acronyms, and all these little
isms,
all these isms that we find in AA and in Celebrate Recovery, they're there for a reason. That's right. And it's certainly not to dissuade you from trying to do it, but it's because they're tried and true, and they work, and there's nothing but truth and healing behind those things. There has to be a willingness to want to look for that. And that, for the first time, I had that willingness. I had that surrender. And that was...
Had you come to that point? I know you said you were praying before. I mean, when you're talking about living in that house in your home without your wife and without your daughter, and was that before rehab, or was that after rehab?
That was right before rehab.
So going into rehab, you said it's 12-step base. Was it associated with any recovery program, or was it kind of its own 12-step?
It was just it was just a little thing. We would have an AA group come in and do it like a Wednesday night meeting. Right. They would come in and bring it into our group setting. But no, it was just like your everyday run-of-the-mill 28-day rehab centers there where I was from. And so it was far enough away where it wasn't directly in my hometown, but it was still... I was able to see our daughter, and so that was nice. And this, the first place that I went to, it was like a 9-hour drive. So I mean, I was out in the middle of nowhere. So I think a little bit of that helped too. Is just having a little bit of that love, and that something to look to and go, okay, well, again, I know that it's all about, it starts and ends with you. It's whether or not you either want to do it or you don't. But for me personally, like having that goal line, being able to see that beautiful little creature, like that, I mean, it was a helpful incentive for me to want to get better. And everybody has their different things. It's the story's the same, but the journeys are all different. And it's just whatever. However it works in your life, but that's for me, that was a motivating thing, is, to see her and like, okay, like, and like I said, little by little, I started getting I started digging. I was willing to do the steps, and I was willing to look in the mirror for the first time in probably 20 years and
Sure.
go, okay,
I wanted to ask
wow,
you,
how did we get here?
that's a much better place to add. That's like that vantage point is a much better one than as far as asking how did we get here than the first one you get to, which is
Yeah.
man, how did we get here?
Yeah.
And then once you start to find, once you start working on your sobriety, that's a much better, how did we get here?
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, is, obviously you mentioned that you were beginning to pray again, before you went into rehab. And I know that you mentioned that you're working, you're going to AA meetings after you get out of rehab. And obviously, a big part of AA, a big part of working the steps is even though they don't have it specifically as Christ being your higher power, you do have to have a higher power.
I did. Yeah.
So at that point, where was your relationship with God? Was that did that start to build hand in hand with your recovery, or was that kind of like, was one before the other?
Yes.
Just walk me through that.
I think it started with me going, okay, I've taken it as far as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I've done everything within my power, and it's gotten me here. I had to kind of really kind of quiet all the outside chatter that, you can do this, you can do that. And it was a conversation that I had between me and God. It literally was like that moment where I'm like, all right, it's been 20 years since I've looked. I've even opened the door or even considered, but I can't, all I know is I look at where I've gotten myself. And I keep hearing this and I keep saying, okay, the higher power thing and this and that. Okay, well, here I am. I need to know. I need to figure it out. So as I'm in this 28-day rehab, I sign up to go to church on a Sunday. And I stress, and I say this, I was only signing up to get out of the facility for 3 hours or 4 hours, whatever it was. I just wanted to change the scenery. At this point, I think I'd been there 2 weeks, and all I saw was a courtyard, a TV room, a bedroom, and classrooms,
mm-hmm.
and then the station where everybody kind of got together, and there's 20 something of us, us guys living in one wing of the, I was ready for just a little bit of a scenery change.
Sure.
But it certainly, at this point I had opened up myself to even letting God in, but I still wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, what's the worst that can hurt? I'm going to go. So get in a bus or get in a van, and like 6 of us, I think, go. And I get there, and it's at this church and there in my hometown. And that is where, for me, everything changed. And I couldn't even tell you what the song was. All I know is that it was the first time in 20 something years that I'd felt, maybe not even that long, it was maybe 20 years, I don't know, 15 years. I felt God's love, like truly felt it. I mean, to the point where I was sobbing uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop. But it was almost, but in that moment when I felt that, it was also, I felt this weight was just lifted. And it was like, he got my attention. He got it through song, of course, with my background. But he did. It was that come to Jesus moment for me when I wasn't wanting it, wasn't expecting it, wasn't even looking for it. And that kind of how it works though, right?
A lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah. And there he was. So I got back to the facility, and man, I'm talking about just a renewed vigor for everything, taking it seriously. My wife was now coming and doing these weekly couples meetings, and she wanted email addresses. She wanted this. She wanted access to everything. And for the first time, I was willing, to here you go. Here's this. Here's that. Hey, I was sure, yeah, hey, I'm going to take your credit card. You're only going to be allowed a certain amount. There was no had all of a sudden been taken out of my vocabulary.
Mm.
Because at this point, I'm just trying, like, I knew it had to be all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There couldn't be parts of me that I wanted to keep for myself. There couldn't be parts of me that I wanted it to keep hidden, because it just doesn't work that way.
Right.
Because eventually it'll boil to the surface. And I can't explain to you why. I have my theories, but I was certainly on that train. I was like, okay, like I feel good. Like I wasn't telling myself maybe I was on that pink cloud a little bit.
Sure.
But things were starting to work. They were slowly but surely working. I was becoming a little bit just more myself, happier for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing was absent. It wasn't about me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I felt there was something greater going on. Like, it wasn't about, hey, world, look at me and check out how awesome I am. It was more about, I'm just a vessel for whatever he has me, whatever the story is supposed to be, however it's supposed to be. Like, I now see that I'm just a player. I'm not the guy in control.
Well, I think that points to the importance, right? For obviously with Celebrate Recovery, we're Christ-centered, and I say we because I'm a part of Celebrate Recovery, but no matter what your higher power, there's a reason why having a higher power is an important part of the recovery process with the 12-step programs that work.
Sure.
And obviously AA and CR tend to be, in NA are kind of like the big three, right?
Sure.
But
yep.
The thing is, we find ourselves. So when you find yourself at rock bottom, like you just described, it also comes with the realization that I don't have any power over this. I'm completely powerless over this. I'm on a train ride that I can't get off of. And so the reason why we have that higher power is you have to put your hope in something bigger than you, because at this point, any hope that you're going to pull yourself out is gone. There's no when you really hit rock bottom, there's no, you have absolutely no, you are not dissolute. You're at the point, you're past the dissolute, like the kind of like this false sense of I'm going to get myself out of this. There's no doubt.
The fairy tale is over.
That's right.
The fairy tale that we tell ourselves, and we've told ourselves, lies and everything that we've woven to keep ourselves using and doing the things that we're doing. It all just, it for the first time, you see it for what it is.
And that's why I made a point to kind of bring up, like, hey, if you're in that place of you're finding yourself in rock bottom, or you're starting to get that sense that you're not in control, the reason why I pointed out, like, hey, pay attention to this, is because at the time it feels so terrible, terrible. But when we look back on it, after we find our higher power, after we find hope in something way bigger than us, you look back on that and you're like, man, what a blessing. Like, what a blessing that time in my life was. Because it got me to the realization that I can't do it on my own.
Yeah.
And so
even parts of even some of the relapses. And when I got out, there were certainly relapses. They weren't as big. They were, but again, it's a part of the story, right? I mean, and I don't like using that relapses. It's a part of the journey. Yes and no. It can be. I certainly was. It doesn't have to be exactly. But for me, it helped me in a way where, like, I was still kind of, I would go and have some momentum, and then I would stop, and I go into momentum. But again, the pitfalls weren't quite as hard as, or the falls weren't quite as hard as they were in the past, but they were still pitfalls, or they were still falls, and they were still taking a toll, not only on me, but because I'm like, man, God, like, come on. And I could see things starting to change, but I get in the way of myself, because I would start bringing myself back into that equation. I would stop relying on God and my fellow, supporters, and it was always, I could always do, I could always pinpoint where the fall was. because at first, it's just, it's that routine you have to set in stone. You
Right.
have to get, so, and I remember one of the last times, actually, it was probably the last time right before it was actually the last time I did that. I checked myself into rehab. I had a small little hiccup, but it was enough to me where, and I came clean with my wife. I said, hey, look, last weekend I was out in the garage. I found blah, blah, blah. It just, I got weak, and this is what I did. And I don't know right now. My mind is racing. Everything's racing. I'm not physically dependent, but I know where I know where this is going to go.
Sure.
If I don't tell you on myself, and I don't tell you, and I'm certainly, of course I was like, I'm trying. I don't know what to tell you, but other than the fact I'm gonna check myself in to my a detox real quick for a weekend, and at that point I walked in and I was doing this, and this is probably now, you know, uh, I looked around and I told myself I'd never become a joke, and there I was, the punchline. You ever heard that? Like,
Yep.
what I'm saying? And I really had that come to moment, like, to self, and I was like, your daughter, your wife have hung on. Your baby's about ready to be born. Actually, your baby is already born now. You're just like, what are you doing? Like, what is it? Like, is this what you want your life to look like? Is this what you want to give to your kids? Is this what you want them to see? Is this what you want for them to think is normal? Because, and what I told myself is, because this is what you're telling them is okay. And for me personally, it wasn't like that. Like, no, because it goes back to, I can go back to my childhood. This is what you were given, and look where it led you. It didn't do the work that I did for myself to get there. But you know what I'm saying? But it planted those seeds. Maybe, it certainly didn't deter me. And so, like, I literally, I did. I got out of there and I was like, okay, like, here's the fork in the road. And I, there it is. And at that moment, and it was that last one. And I just said, yeah, I can't. And so, again, just back to AA 2 times a day, doing everything I can. And then that stretched for almost like, I think 9 months. And then that's when we moved to Ohio. And then I came back, and like I said at the beginning of the story, and then I walked into the Celebrate Recovery, and everything that I'd been through, everything that God had broken down in me and worked on, as soon as I walked in those doors all made sense. Like, nothing about my experience at the village, I won't, I mean, it was perfect. You know what I'm saying? Because everything that God had been preparing me to do came to fruition there. Like, this saving me and just changing my life, and allowing myself to be under, to know that He loved me. He loves me for who I am, and He forgives me for who I'm not. That made the biggest difference in the world. Like, as soon as I knew, and I'm not saying that I didn't have his strength behind me, but it solidified it in a way that I didn't know could happen. That wasn't my experience with God. Remember, I come from where God was a punishing God, and I walked into those doors, and it was like, no, God loves you no matter what. Don't worry about the things that you did. That's why I created, that's why you're here. It's time to do some work, buddy.
Yeah.
It's time to look in the mirror, but it's time to not feel sorry for yourself. It's time to not blame other people. It's time to take an inventory and an account, and take some responsibility and accountability for what role you played in all of this. And it's time to forgive yourself. I think that's the biggest part. I was able to forgive myself.
Yeah, I remember, and I remember when because I've been around recovery for about 12 or 13 years now.
Yeah.
But I'm a slow learner, so it took a while to stick. But
aren't we all?
Right. Yeah, that tends to be a thing in recovery, and we're all slow learners here.
Yeah.
And I remember when you first came in. I remember you were not the same person today that you were when you first walked in those doors. And I even remember that in the sorry shape that I was in back then. And honestly, I feel like I'm going to kind of make a call right here, because man, there was a lot in that first. I feel like there's so much that goes into what happens after you guys move to Ohio and you get involved with Celebrate Recover. I kind of want to, what I would like to do is let's save that for a part 2.
Okay.
Because I there's a lot going into it, I love hearing the stories that lead up to finding recovery. But I also would I think I'd be doing a disservice to not give as much time and as much attention to all of the process that comes after getting sober, because that's where some real change starts to happen.
Absolutely.
So, and I would like to talk about how your relationship rebuilt, you rebuilt your marriage, and the impact that you had when the other people at CR, which is kind of birthed out of that, man. Like you can't really help other people until you get to that place where you forgive yourself, and that's where it sounds like you're getting to. So I want to make sure I want to do an entire another episode on just that. So
for sure.
So first of all, thank you for being here, for taking the time to do this. But before we finish, is there any kind of closing words that you would like to leave?
No, man. I'm always grateful for the opportunity just to be heard, and to just for somebody out there who was just like me, or who may just be like me, and just doesn't think it's possible or they're capable. I certainly have been there. I certainly sometimes still get there. But the truth in the matter is that you're so worth it. God doesn't make mistakes, and God does forgive you, and He loves you. And this can be done. There's a lot of hard work that goes into it, but I can tell you without a doubt, 100%, the past 7.5, almost 8 years of my life being sober have been the best years of my life. And I've had some really tough, moments in my life in those periods, but how I reacted to it and how I was able to cope was just something that 15 years ago, I wouldn't have thought. I couldn't have imagined going through that without something in my hand or putting something in my body. And, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. But we are all, our story is one. And I want people to always understand that you're not alone. I know that when you hear that, you go, sure, yeah. But, but we're not. You're not. We just have to find, that surrender and that willingness. It starts with it has to start with that surrender and the willingness. If you don't have that, God, I pray that, God, that you get there at some point. And that's fine if you don't, because we still love you. I still love you, because I've been there, and I know what it feels like to be there and to be afraid and to be absolutely, just not knowing what it looks like. I'm here to tell you that it can look great. It's just whether or not you choose to do the work and surrender.
Mitch told me that if you, I'm going to probably get this a little bit wrong, that the promise of recovery is that you don't have to live the way you've been living if you don't want to live the way you've been living. Yeah. And I'm probably butchering that ism a little bit, but it's definitely true. And I think your story absolutely speaks to that. So, Man,
I
thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much for doing this. I'm looking forward to doing the second part with you. So
Cool.
we'll get that done hopefully in the next month or so. So
Yeah.
thanks, man.
And no, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you for what you're doing. And I think this is a great little spotlight on for guys like us. And I know God's doing some great things in your life as well too. And I'm so proud of you and where you are in your journey and your story. And I'm looking forward to many more years and many more exciting things to come down the pipe for you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. And thank
No
you,
problem.
everybody who listened. And be sure to check out some of the other episodes and for more to come. So thanks. Have a great day.